The problem is that you have to judge the early release scheme by what exact offence people were convicted of. And these two men were convicted of manslaughter. There are nearly 1,000 people in prisons convicted of manslaughter, some of whom would be eligible for early release, some of whom wouldn't. And so you get to the position where you're having to release hundreds of people. And the problem is that the Prime Minister has already said, and he's been told by the civil service, you've done as much as you can do. If you release any more, then if you fail to release any more, then the prisons will be overstuffed and you run out of space in prisons.
Andy Burnham is continuing his policy blitz on his first day back from holiday by announcing that subscriptions will be easier to cancel and companies will be compelled to make it clear when contracts auto-renew at a higher price. The package of changes, originally announced by his predecessor Keir Starmer, will end so-called subscription traps, but the Conservatives have dubbed the move reheated, saying the Prime Minister's already run out of ideas. Meanwhile, Downing Street has announced it cannot stop the early release of Jesse Cole and Albert Boas, the killers of PC Andrew Harper, despite public outcry. That, of course, relating to the early release of prisoners. Well, here to give us the latest is Dan Bloom, the UK political editor for Politico. Dan, good evening to you.
Good evening.
Before we get on to Andy Burnham, just a quick word about the freshest story this evening, which concerns the amount of, or the area of England that has slipped into drought, nearly 3/4. It is a serious situation. We'll be discussing it throughout the show, but I think one of the obvious questions is whether the government will be forced to intervene, whether that means perhaps harsher sanctions on businesses, or whether there is anything the government can do to try and mitigate for these now record-breaking drought periods.
Well, it's a very good question, and the government's been peppered with these questions about whether it would intervene, particularly on food supply and that kind of aspect, for a while now. And the response that we've had is that food supply is secure, that there is nothing to worry about here. But there is secure and there is completely secure. And I think when you look at the kind of the small print of this quite big release we've had from the government tonight on these new areas of drought, it is saying things like farmers have had their earliest harvests in 20 years. They've had reduced yields. That means, smaller vegetables. Livestock farmers are pulling out their winter feed early because all the grass has died. We're talking about having decreased milk volumes from cows. And we've got wildlife being affected too, particularly breeding birds and that kind of thing. So this is not an ideal situation. And it basically leads to a situation where food is more expensive in the shops. And there's not much that the government can do about that, apart from, what Rachel Reeves tried to do when prices were going up in the supermarkets, which was sort of have the supermarkets in for a meeting and say, don't do price gouging and don't raise, prices too high. That didn't go very well for Rachel Reeves last time because the supermarkets said, we're not price gouging. We have very thin margins and food in British supermarkets is cheaper than many countries in Europe. So we're not at some kind of, crisis, food running out or indeed standpipes in the streets like in 1976 situation here. But we don't know when this is going to end. We've got another heat wave this week. And the longer it goes on, of course, the worse it gets.
Yeah. There's also the issue of whether the government's doing enough to ensure that water companies are hanging on to the water that they have. In other words, preventing leaks. And we've heard plenty of talk, haven't we, about the nationalisation of public utilities, including water companies as well. And it's interesting to know, I mean, you learn as you read, Dan, and dry soil. So when soil is particularly dry, it means that leaks worsen because pipes can move around. If the soil isn't wet, then the pipes stay. If the soil isn't wet, the pipes can move around. So there'll be questions about number of leaks, won't there? About why there aren't enough reservoirs, etc. All of these questions, I think, we can expect to perhaps pepper their way into the back end of recess and perhaps the beginning of the new term of Parliament.
I think you're right about that. I didn't know the thing about pipes moving around in dry ground.
Every day's a school day, Dan.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, you look at my garden and, when the ground's dry, all the water just seeps away. You don't know where it's gone. And because it's, it's kind of like dust. But it's interesting you raise the question of more structural reform of the water companies, because Andy Burnham has talked about, more public control. He doesn't say nationalisation, just as a side point. He says more public control, which means we don't quite know what model he's talking about. We're not talking about just a straight buyout of the water companies by the state here in full nationalisation. We're talking about models potentially like mutualisation or restructures or that sort of thing, group ownership by members of the public and this sort of stuff which I'm going to admit I don't fully understand because I don't know which option they've gone for. And as far as I can tell, they're not sort of rushing forward with some grand plan as a sort of short-term response or to grab a headline off the back of everyone looking at the water companies right now. But it's clear that Andy Burnham has thought that this system is broken for a long time. And what this drought does is it ramps up the pressure on him to actually come up with a solution as part of the first 4 days.
And any solution is going to cost money, which is probably why it's been avoided so far. What Andy Burnham is doing, though, he's vowing to crack down on sort of rip-off business practices. These are, I was joking earlier about him turning into Gloria Hunniford from Rip-Off Britain, but this is Andy Burnham's cheap way, if I'm honest, at trying to help Britain with the cost of living crisis. He's trying to make you aware that you can cancel a subscription. He's trying to stop businesses from inflating prices before then reducing everything by 50%. So it seems cheap, but actually it isn't. It's piecemeal, it's small, but it won't actually cost the taxpayer, the government, anything at all, will it?
Yeah, when you look at the stuff that he did in his first week, including bus fare caps and VAT off energy bills, that was kind of £1.5 billion. And when you look at the things he's announcing this week, sure, we know some of what he'll announce later, but we can't talk about it because of embargoes and stuff. But the steer that I had into this morning's Playbook newsletter was that actually we're not going to be spending a huge amount of money on the announcements this week, just like you say with this one on subscription traps, compared to what he did in his first week. And that's because he had to do a lot of jiggling of sort of where the money was coming from. And there were a lot of arguments over whether his basis for getting that money was, accurate and fair. And so he's kind of avoided these things this time, but it means that he's using less of a sledgehammer. And I think the issue with that first week was that these were quite sort of big attention-grabbing examples, and you cannot announce policy like that every day in government because you'll run out of money and you'll run out of levers to pull. Yeah. So he's left with something that Keir Starmer announced, as you said, and it has been subscription traps has been brought forward 3 months, and on the fake discounts, was £1,000 when it wasn't really. That's a consultation for later this year.
OK, and we know we'll get something a little later on. As you say, can't talk about that yet, but I'm sure you'll hear more with Carol Walker, if not before, on this evening's schedule. Let's talk about PC Harper's killers now. There is a petition. I think the number of signatures on it is nearly 900,000, Dan, at the moment. The government can't keep them behind bars, though. This is what Number 10 has come out and said today, despite, you get the feeling, certainly from the writing around this and the reporting around it, he really wants to do something, but his hands are tied, essentially, by the guidelines of the early release programme as to what he can and cannot do. Exactly what has he said, and is this the end of it now that his killers will be released?
Well, I don't think it would be fair to say it's the end of it, because this is such a political pressure point for any Prime Minister, particularly a Labour Prime Minister, and particularly in this sort of summer period where crime and justice just sort of tend to ramp up the agenda and ahead of those actual early releases in the autumn. What Downing Street has sort of confirmed at the lobby briefing is that you have an issue of unfair treatment of one prisoner against another. So it seems that they did look at this idea of releasing a kind of quite small, not releasing a small group of prisoners, which would have included those two killers of Andrew Harper, on the basis of, people who were convicted of manslaughter of an emergency worker or killing an emergency worker or something. The problem is that you have to judge the early release scheme by what exact offence people were convicted of. And these two men were convicted of manslaughter. There are nearly 1,000 people in prisons convicted of manslaughter, some of whom would be eligible for early release, some of whom wouldn't. And so you get to the position where you're having to release hundreds of people. And the problem is that the Prime Minister has already said, and he's being told by the civil service, you've done as much as you can do. If you release any more, then if you fail to release any more, then the prisons will be overstuffed and you run out of space in prisons. And dare I say it, even if he did this case and he stopped those two men from being released, there would probably be another case that would find its way to the top of the news agenda that was being released, and you end up in this position again and again. So it's very tricky as a political test of where he draws that line.
And just a final word on Reform's big announcement today. What are they calling for, and is it workable, Dan?
Well, they're calling for all 10,000 foreign nationals in the prison system to be deported either to their countries of origin, or if they won't take them, or so forth, to a third country that Britain would essentially rent prison spaces from. And they've talked about El Salvador and Kosovo and a couple of others. Now, I'm not one to sit here and say that something won't work automatically. It's a complex and nuanced scheme. But we know that previous governments have had an awful lot of trouble with deportations. Reform say that they wouldn't have this trouble because they would sweep away kind of legal protections for migrants and so forth. But no government has been able to do this without trouble. It costs a lot more money than people think it will most of the time. And there are all sorts of practical hurdles. And I got to the point where they said in their release that all foreign nationals in prison will be deported, and there will be 10,000 people deported. Actually, a third of those 10,000 are awaiting trial. They haven't been convicted of a crime yet. So the numbers don't quite seem to add up on that. Reform was asked about this today, and Zia Yusuf said that's not some kind of gotcha. Most of these people are convicted in the end anyway. But it's that kind of attention to detail that is important and becomes paramount when you end up in government. Yeah,
and you've got increased costs, even if they are being held in custody. You've got increased costs of getting them over for court appearances to the UK, which is even higher if they've not had a conviction yet. Dan, makes sense to me. Thank you, Dan Bloom, who is the UK political editor for Politico and is more often than not the writer of the London Playbook released every morning. Always a great read. Dan, thank you for being with us. Really appreciate it.